I'm still on top of this cold, so I'm not. I won't be sneezing on you or anything during this. But what I want to do is, yesterday, in the limited time that we had together to begin with, I wanted to just introduce you to the idea that this discussion about a new paradigm, especially in the context of being architects of a new paradigm, really required, I think, for us to understand that there are there are three different issues we need to consider. One is whether or not it's a legitimate undertaking to attempt to construct a paradigm. As you know, Foster and Kimberly have been talking about during the course of here that there's an argument to be made that the proponents of a worldview or any type of a definitive paradigm of any kind tend to be the people that are in charge of religions or the state, attempting to sort of superimpose an idea upon others so that they can use it to control people. And so there's a fundamental question that's been posed as to the legitimacy of a worldview at all, or a paradigm of any specific kind. And you will see over and over again the fact that a paradigm or a worldview has the effect of basically trying to coordinate and get people together in a shared view of reality that will tend to cause people to, when faced with particular types of public policy challenges, to generate the same kind of general proposals as to how one goes about resolving those public policy problems in a way that's consistent with a certain set of common assumptions of fact that the community shares. So I want to say right at the outset that again, the discussion that we had last night, the panel, you saw this issue come up again as to whether or not it is a legitimate undertaking on the part of people in our species to place any kind of an adequate degree of trust in any type of central institution of any kind to facilitate articulating a worldview. Again, reiterating the distrust that Foster and others have articulated of state institutions or religious institutions, given the bad history that we've seen. So you heard me last night. I was saying that even though I've spent an entire career, 45 years, challenging the authority of the state, challenging the unjust exercise of authority on the part of church and ecclesial authorities, that I believe that in light of the challenges that we're confronted by, with especially this recent onset of global climate change and the continued effort on the part of the owners of the top 100 or so major transnational business corporations to continue the process of poisoning the planet and in emitting these global greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere to drive the sea levels up and the temperature up, et cetera, that there's this potential crisis or catastrophe that is potentially going to be confronting us. I believe that this is one of those types of collective challenges to our human community that really requires some type of a common sense among us all as to what we should do about this. That it's not a matter of just all of us saying, here, let's suggest that the owners of the corporations voluntarily refrain from continuing to do this. You know, the question that one has to ask is, how are we doing on that one? How cooperative are they with this? It isn't as though people haven't been making clear to them the fact that we're unhappy about the fact that they're doing this, and we'd like them to stop doing this, that they've actually gone to the point of hiring their small handful of scientists to construct an entire set of challenges to the 2,000 scientists around the world who are telling us what the evidence is that this is happening. So that there's not only a lack of voluntary willingness on the part of the owners of these major corporations to change their conduct, they're engaged in a dialectical, confrontational challenge to us to insist upon going forward to do this. So I just wanted to make those kind of initial remarks to suggest that I believe that there's a legitimate reason for us as a human community to want to look toward identifying some type of common set of values, common set of beliefs that we can legitimately come to, on the basis of which we can come to some sort of resolution as to what we can do about this. That we need to do something about this. We need to take some type of collective action together to do something about this and other things. And that is what a worldview or a paradigm really does. It provides a common set of basic assumptions about some fundamental premises of the world that we can share, and on the basis of which we can go forward and make decisions. Now, yesterday I pointed out to you that there are a number of contenders for this title of the dominant worldview that our people should adhere to. And at the present time, we're still faced with a particular scientific materialist worldview. That despite, I pointed out briefly that despite all of the discoveries that were made between 1923 and 1926 in the realm of quantum physics that tend to put the lie directly to the fundamental assumptions of Newton and Descartes and the others that believed that our world is made up of a number of little billiard balls that all sort of bang together in some kind of incoherent manner, and that everything is just sort of a result of the mechanical banging together of atoms, of elements. That despite the fact that the quantum scientists have now shown that there's much more going on than just that, there's a great institutional inertia on the part of the major institutions in our world to stay attached to that Newtonian Cartesian worldview. And because of that, there's been this discussion about what type of a new paradigm we might be able to discern that would have the degree of persuasiveness that could basically offset the continued attachment to that particular worldview. And I pointed out that there is a spectrum of present worldviews, all of which, the adherents to each of which, keep insisting that they're still correct. That if all of us would just come to understand their particular worldview and what the underlying factual assumptions are of their worldview, then everything would be okay. Because then we could get a clear consensus as to what to do about it. And one of the things I want to point out here in the time we have here together, I want to show you that the fact is that if one adheres consistently to any one of these worldviews, they do in fact generate a very clear, specific set of proposals as to what one ought to do about a particular situation. And so that it is true that if the adherents to all six of the other major worldviews were to give in and accept one particular worldview, we could get some consensus as to what to do about a particular crisis. The fact of the matter is that doesn't happen, that we don't let go of our adherence to these other worldviews. So what I want to do today is I want to point out why it is that it's so difficult for people to let go of one of their worldviews, and then have us try to figure out together how we would therefore go about succeeding in lifting up some new worldview that could actually attract people to that worldview. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is, as I touched upon yesterday, that there has been a good deal of work that has been done in this particular field by sociologists, and the major universities, or the academy, as they refer to themselves collectively, has come to a fairly clear insight about the fact that there are a certain set number of beliefs that constitute a pillar set of beliefs, 4 basic beliefs that I pointed out yesterday, that a person will come to in their own life, at least unconsciously, about these ultimate questions of fact that become determinative of the worldview that they're going to adhere to. Now, I pointed that out as a matter of fact, and I identified what those were: the cosmological beliefs, the teleological beliefs, the ontological beliefs, and the epistemological beliefs, which I pointed out are just great big words to explain, first, what people believe about how the universe came into existence. The second one, the teleology, is really what they believe about how the universe is unfolding, and whether it's unfolding towards some specific end that lends a pattern to understanding how the universe is unfolding, so that you can discern some type of meaning within what's happening in the universe, so that we can relate to that meaning in some way. Then the epistemological question, or the ontological question, and that is that how did consciousness come into existence in the midst of this cosmos of rocks and stars and planets and elements? How did this process generate in some way consciousness that we experience ourselves, and that we're so convinced is a very real thing? And that we see manifest in other sentient beings, all the way from amoebas all the way to, bears, lions, and tigers, and bears, and us. And the fourth question that was the epistemological question is, what are the means that we have at our disposal by means of which we can possibly even gather data that's reliable enough to answer questions like that? So we touched upon that yesterday, and what I want to do is I want to, as preliminary to our discussion together, I want to show what this means sort of in concrete practice. One would say, well, how does this function to generate a particular worldview? As I pointed out yesterday, these different worldviews that we talked about. That the one of them I talked about is the right systematist worldview that Talcott Parsons identified, which generates this authoritarian political philosophy. This authoritarian worldview, that how do these component elements generate such a view? And let's go through them just quickly. Cosmologically, the adherence to the authoritarian or first paradigm worldview, the right systemist worldview, cosmologically, they believe that our universe began with a single big bang, that there was a particular point in time when the universe came into existence with this gigantic big bang. And that since that point in time, they have no position with regard to what was going on before that, where it came from. It's just that it is happening. And it started with the Big Bang. And the teleological understanding, the second major position, is that from that point of the Big Bang, that they exploded out from the center of the Big Bang, and that the universe is expanding out and away from the locus of the Big Bang, and that all of the matter in the universe has been scattered out and is expanding out and away from the locus of the Big Bang, and that at the same time, all of the particular elements that are existent inside the matter of the universe are disintegrating. If you look at the periodic table with the some 248 or so different elements that are in the periodic table, each one of these is disintegrating at the rate of what we call their half-life, their atomic half-life, that they're disintegrating into the smaller constituent elements that make them up. And so that there's this process going on, the teleological process that the right systematists believe is going on, is that the universe is expanding and disintegrating at the same time. And that ultimately there'll come a point where every single one of the elements in the universe, the 200 plus elements in the universe, will have disintegrated all into their smallest constituent parts until every single element has disintegrated into its ultimately non-divisible integers of matter, which are these inchoate quantum fields. And that they continue to expand out and away from each other because of the impetus that was imposed upon them by the initial Big Bang, and that there will come a point in time when ultimately every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe will stand separate and apart from every other one. And at that point, the impetus will still continue. And they will continue out and away from each other. After they've completely separated out into the ultimately non-divisible units of matter, this will dissipate out into the infinite and eternal space of outer space, and the entire universe will be gone. It will disintegrate into nothing. Literally, no thing, no thingness will occur. Now, as you might guess, this is a fairly pessimistic view, resultantly, that what they do is that's the cosmological assumption and teleological assumption. Ontologically, they believe that consciousness, this experience of consciousness that we have, is nothing but an epiphenomenon that happens to be generated by a certain confluence of mass and energy that happen to come together randomly during the process of this expansion, and that there is a period of time during which a certain confluence of mass and energy has come together that happens to generate the epiphenomenon of consciousness, and that as the elements disintegrate that make up an entity that has consciousness, that consciousness will disintegrate and go away, and so that the ontological question is answered in that this is nothing but an epiphenomenon. And the fourth question, the epistemological question, is, well, what means do we have at our disposal as human beings by means of which we can answer these questions like this? They believe that we are confined to our five senses. They've recognized that we can, see, touch, taste, smell, feel. We have these particular human faculties, and that we can therefore gather data through an exercise of these senses that we have, and we can process it through our intellect and our intelligence, and that is what enables us to answer these questions. And these are the answers that they come to. And what that does is it ends up, if you answer all four of those questions, the cosmological question, the teleological question, the ontological question, and the epistemological question, the big words for these ideas, that if you answer all of those four questions consistently, you end up with a mode of ethical reasoning is that what the hell is the point? If that's all that's really going on here, isn't it clear that when confronted with any particular situation, you would choose that one that generates the greatest degree of pleasure that you can possibly get and the least amount of pain? Perfectly obvious, because you try to maximize your pleasure and minimize your pain during that small interim of time that you happen to be at random existing as a certain confluence of mass and energy. And in fact, that's exactly what the mode of ethical reasoning is that is generated by that particular worldview. Each individual person is supposed to be trying to seek their greatest amount of pleasure and least amount of pain. And the fact is that it's a highly competitive dog-eat-dog survival existence. That this is the mode of ethical reasoning. Thomas Hobbes set forth the entire philosophy of this. It's really quite well known, very famous, and in fact, it points out that that's the only ethos or ethical standard that means anything. Machiavelli talked about it at great length, predicated upon these factual assumptions about reality. And so that what happens is, needless to say, that tends to generate an authoritarian political philosophy, is that in the chaos of everyone competing with each other and seeking their own self-interest, short-term self-interest and maximum pleasure and minimal pain, that in fact you need some type of order to things, because there is no order. Because just through the exercise of their five senses, they can't really discern any type of order. All they can see is that the universe is ultimately expanding and disintegrating into nothing. And so therefore, the way to impose order on an otherwise chaotic universe is to have some individual who is more powerful, smarter, stronger, faster than others. That what they can do is they can superimpose upon an otherwise chaotic community a certain degree of order. And even if that order is tending to generate a great deal of benefit to the authoritarian ruler, there are derivative benefits that are obtained by the populace. That they have clarity, they have clear rules, they have order, and this is the worldview of the authoritarian. This is the first paradigm worldview of the right systematists. Now, so the question is that how does that differ from the right marginalists? These people that in fact become reactionaries, as distinct from authoritarians. The cosmological assumption here is that, again, the universe starts with a Big Bang. It is expanding out and away from the locus of the Big Bang. It is still indeed disintegrating. It is, in fact, disintegrating into its ultimately irreducible integers of matter, and it expands out to a point where every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe is separate and apart from every other one. But they believe that at that particular point in time, when every single one of the inchoate quantum fields into which the matter can be divided ends up standing separate and apart from each other, that there is a state of stasis that occurs. That at that particular point, the impetus that has been imposed upon those integers of matter by the Big Bang, in fact, expires. And that there's a moment of stasis, and that the attraction that every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the universe has for every other one then begins to set back in, and they begin to be attracted back toward each other. And they begin to come back into groupings of inchoate quantum fields that generate muons and leptons and quarks and neutrinos and electrons and neutrons and protons and atoms and elements and mixtures and compounds and planets and star systems. This is what happens, is that it then begins to collapse back in, and there's another cycle. There's another cycle in which the matter tends to come together and generate these things that make up the universe. And during that process, there is a reintegration of matter in such a way that consciousness actually is generated again. There is a gathering together, a collective of these inchoate quantum fields, these integers of matter, that end up generating consciousness. And so that you get a cycle. You get a cycle of expanding out from the locus of the Big Bang and then condensing back in, to the point where eventually every single one of the ultimately irreducible integers of matter in the universe are back in direct, immediate physical contact with every other one. This is that strange discussion you hear the physicists having, that the entire universe is condensed to the size of the head of a pin. And exactly at that point, the polarity reverses, and every single one of these integers of matter repels every other one. And you have a repeat of the Big Bang. And so that you get the expanding out and away from the locus of the Big Bang, and the process goes on again. And that this cycle happens over and over again. This is called the cosmological theory of the oscillating cosmos. This is the great return. It's like a heartbeat of an expanding and contracting and expanding and contracting, and that in the process it generates consciousness, and then in the collapse it generates consciousness, and that this is the ultimate cosmological and teleological set of assumptions of the second paradigm worldview. And what they believe is that whereas the adherents to an authoritarian worldview believe that the universe is totally chaos and just disintegrating into nothingness, the oscillating cosmos, the second paradigm people, have a different cosmology. And they believe that beneath the entire appearance of chaos in the universe, there's in fact a cycle of expansion and condensing. An expansion and condensing. There is a diode taking place. There's a Tao, if you will, taking place between the state of ultimate expansion and ultimate contraction. And so that there is an instinctive discernment on the part of these particular adherents that there's an underlying dynamic, a dialectical dynamic that exists in the universe. Therefore, they can have a mode of ethical reasoning, which means that you can discern some meaning in this. It is just not chaos disintegrating into nothingness. There is actually a fundamental underlying dialectical dynamic. And so therefore, if you can get on one side or the other of a bipolar dynamic, you can actually become part of this unified process. And so that what you see is these peculiar dividing up into teams of good guys and bad guys, and blue team and red team. In fact, there's a very famous anthropological study that Margaret Mead did that she went down to New Guinea. They found on one of the islands in New Guinea, way back in the deep jungles, they found this valley with these tribes that were in this valley, and there were these two tribes that lived in this valley. And one of them lived up on one side of the valley, and the other one lived up on the other side of the valley. And what she did is their teams set themselves up the top of these big mountains and were watching them through telescopes, etc. And that they could see that what they were doing is they would come down, the males would come down onto the valley floor, and they would engage in hunting parties. And they would hunt and gather food and stuff and go back. And they would continue this process until two of the hunting parties encountered each other, at which point they would then begin to fight. And they would fight until one person was killed. And as soon as one person was killed, they'd stop. And then they would go back. The tribe that had the person killed would go back to their side of the valley, and they would have this huge ceremony of a dirge and throwing ashes on themselves and lamenting the death of this person. And the other tribe would have this gigantic celebration and this huge fertility rite, and they would all become intoxicated upon this drink that they had and have this huge orgy. And then she discovered over time that they were taking turns doing this. And this lent some kind of meaning to their existence in this valley. And this is just a microcosmic demonstration of this dynamic, of the bipolar dialectical dynamic of a second paradigm worldview. As we're gathered here together today, the North Carolina Panthers, are playing the Seattle Seahawks, the red team versus the blue team, and they're struggling over a rubber ball, going back and forth on this field, and there are millions of people jumping up and down, cheering and crying, over this event, and it lends a great deal of meaning to these people, and so this is a very real worldview. Now, the problem with the challenge with this worldview is that this oscillation between the ultimate expansion and contraction of the universe, the material in the universe, pursuant to this particular theory, repeats itself over and over and over again in an absolutely identical way. because the fact of the matter is that the mechanics of the interaction of all of those physical particles is exactly the same over and over again. And so there is this complete predetermination. This is that whole doctrine of predetermination that you've heard about, and that this is what goes on. I remember having this one whole long afternoon discussion with Marlon Brando. He was a complete freak about this. He was a complete adherent to this particular worldview, and believed that everything was completely predicted. And that life was just like billiard balls. If you could understand exactly the pressure that was put on the cue ball to break the billiard balls, you could predict where every single one of them was going to go. That there was no free will. That free will was a complete illusion on the part of the sentient beings in this process, and it just plays itself out over and over again. But thank goodness you're ignorant of that. That you think that you got free will, you think you know what you're doing, but you don't. And the fact is that if you really understood all of the astrological predilections that you have, given your place and time of birth, if you understood all the genetic material that was in your body, if you understood all of the cultural, psychological pressures you were put under as a child, the cultural teachings that you could predict to a 99% certainty exactly what you're going to do. When you're confronted with any given type of situation. I mean, you've all had that horrifying experience of your first reading by an astrologer, but the fact of the matter is that inside this particular worldview, the people believe that if they will just get themselves on one side or another of a team, then it lends meaning to their life, and that it's a choice that they're making. Now, there's a third paradigm worldview, which is what I call the right middle marginalist. The right middle marginalist is the conservative worldview. What they believe a very similar cosmological view and teleological view, but the extraordinarily important difference in here is that they believe that you can make an existential choice. You can make an existential choice. You can apply the intellect. You can actually apply our intelligence, that sentient beings develop intelligence, and you can actually direct your intelligence toward monitoring this process. And you can see that this dynamic, this dialectical dynamic is going on. You can discern that but for the intercession of an act of real free will, that is going to continue to repeat itself over and over again. But they believe that you can actually generate a degree of independence through free will if you can gather enough data. If you can really understand your astrological chart, you can understand your genetic and makeup. You can, if you gather enough data, you can actually open up a small area of free will if you're disciplined enough, and you can make a judgment that you can intervene. But what you do is that, for the most part, this is a little complicated, but if you can actually gather all of the data that flows up into making up your world, you can discern a certain algorithm and pattern that this information has, and you can work out intellectually a formula as to where it's likely to be going, and you can project an algorithm of where this reality might be going, and you can choose. You can make a choice as to which of the alternatives you want to actually manifest. And this is an existential choice. Kant is a very major player in this whole process. Hegel, as you might guess, is over here, and you've got Hobbes over here. These are the major philosophers of these particular worldviews. But you have Kant will point out that you cannot really ascertain all of objective reality, because you're caught, you're conditioned, you're inside the kind of relative conditioning that you have, so you can only make a relative judgment about reality. But having done that, you can make an existential choice, and you've all read all of that fairly depressing esoteric literature about existentialism of not despairing in the face of a despairing world, and you can make an existential choice to choose to believe that you're going to achieve a certain thing, even though you have this sneaking suspicion it isn't true. But this is the classic existential worldview, but it's predicated upon an assumption that we can, through an exercise of our intellect, we can intervene in the otherwise completely predetermined mechanistic oscillation of the universe. So you begin to see here that there's a direct relationship between the assumptions that one makes about the cosmological origins and nature of the universe itself, the teleological process of the unfolding, the ontological question about the role of consciousness that plays in this, and the methods by means of which we can ascertain the facts in this thing. So that there are others that go clear to the other end. For example, you can see how radically different some of these are. You come over here to the utopian worldview, for example, and what they believe here is that, in fact, there is an infinite and eternal, abiding, absolute sea of undifferentiated consciousness that simply obtains, and that there is a cycle that occurs pursuant to which the infinite and eternal unconditioned consciousness actually enfolds into being a finite sea of apparently differentiated inchoate quantum fields. That this is an emanationist theory of the universe, that the universe is sort of enfolded into being by an act of this infinite and eternal consciousness that is otherwise totally undifferentiated. And what happens is there's the generation of a finite sea, a finite number of individuated inchoate quantum fields. Now, when I say inchoate quantum fields, if in fact what they've discovered now is you take an atom of an element and you collide the atoms together and you break these into smaller particles and you loosen the protons and the neutrons and the electrons, and then you smash them together in a collider and they break into smaller and smaller pieces. You've all been following this. Is they break down into quarks and neutrinos and mesons and muons, and they keep on going until they get down to a point where they actually can collide two of the particles together and they break into these inchoate quantum fields that they actually disappear. It's not just that you can't find them because they're so small. They actually have no material manifestation at all, but they're there. And these inchoate quantum fields, when observed, they will see that they will flash up into material manifestation as either a wave of energy and then flash back out of material manifestation. And then they'll flash back into material manifestation, either as a wave of energy again or as a particle of mass. And that then they will drop back out of material manifestation. And that this whole process of the materialization of inchoate quantum fields into one or another of the two forms of matter, mass or energy, is the underlying fundamental dynamic by means of which the universe manifests itself in the material realm, but that it exists otherwise in an inchoate form. Pursuant to this particular cosmological theory, that the infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness does not exist with any subdifferentiated aspects to it whatsoever. This is just an infinite, eternal, abiding in a completely undifferentiated experience of consciousness. Now remember, it's essential to understand that this is not a noun. It is not a noun because it has no finite boundaries. It has no definitional qualities of it at all. It is in fact a verb, the ultimate non-transitive verb of simple being. and that there is this important dynamic that goes on of this stage that occurs where there is this issuing forth of a finite sea of undifferentiated, or of now for the first time differentiated inchoate quantum fields, and there's a finite number of them. Now there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them, but it's a finite number. Therefore, the finite number, even though it's in a completely inchoate state, has generated an inchoate universe that has finitude. And therefore, that is the first noun, even though it has no material manifestation. And this is now you don't encounter this discussion often, but it's one that's been going on for some time among theologians and major physicists about what that event was like. What was that moment like? And that's the one they're exploring for, that you hear them all looking for. What was going on just before the Big Bang? They talk. But what it really points out is that this is something that was going on well before the Big Bang, because the generation of this now finite sea of a finite number of inchoate quantum fields actually is the origin of the universe in its ultimately expanded form. Because what happens is that there's a moment, and we'll get into this, when we're really trying to, the mission that we have here today before us, as I've said, is to try to figure out at the ultimate levels what's really going on in the universe, so that we don't look like utter fools when it comes time to try to articulate to a much more sophisticated extraterrestrial civilization that has millions of years in advance of us, technologically and scientifically, and potentially spiritually. We've got to really, while one at the same time, we have to still worry about maintaining our credibility with the academy and the political forces and the cultural institutions and the churches, etc. As I pointed out yesterday, we've got this challenge. If we're going to be encountered by a major extraterrestrial civilization that may well be well in advance of us technologically, the reality is we do not want to go the same way of all the other civilizations that have been encountered by a much more highly technologically developed culture and then just disappear and be completely assimilated into the other culture and have our species completely disappear. So we have to basically, in a sense, make a better accounting of ourselves. We have to be able to come to grips with, basically removing the constraints that have been placed upon us by the academy and the institutions to try to continue to placate those who have developed worldviews which keep them in charge. And that's what we're engaged in here today. And so that this is beginning to show you what the full-scale implications of these cosmological and teleological assumptions are that undergird these worldviews. And what I want to do today is I want to, since we're here to talk about the architecture of a potentially genuinely new paradigm, the question that arises is what are the radically new potential insights that we can have as to what may well be going on. And what I want to do, as I've said yesterday, I want to be able to postulate and to proffer for us in the new paradigm community a potential deductive hypothesis that can be partnered with the inductive hypothesis, the quantum worldview that is in the offing and is in the process of being developed by the California Institute for Integral Studies and the Institute for Noetic Sciences and Ken Wilber and a lot of the other people that are all working on this end, working our way up out from the middle of this into pointing toward potential characteristics of the new paradigm. What I would like to be able to do is put in front of us a potential deductive hypothesis of the worldview so that we can see whether or not these begin to move toward each other at all. And so what I'd like to do is suggest that if in fact, we can do it, there's a simple way of doing this. We could say, look, what if we found ourselves, the 150 of us or whatever here, that we found ourselves all taken up on a UFO and brought to another civilization, and we're brought together in a room like this, and we're supposed to be having a meeting. We're getting set to go meet with a number of their people and representatives, and they're going to ask us to explain to them what we think is really going on in the universe, and how do we really fit into it. And we may have, a Catholic bishop among us that's going to come in and tell them, what the Pope said recently, or we can try to figure out ourselves what we're going to be suggesting. And what I'm suggesting is that the best that we can do right now, I think, is we can utilize the architecture that has been proposed by the Academy to understand that we need to answer this cosmological, teleological, ontological, and epistemological question. And we need to try to understand what mode of ethical reasoning our assumptions would generate, what kind of a philosophy, what kind of a political philosophy. And so what I want to do is I want to lay some of these out for you, because I've spent a good deal of time thinking about this and talking with people about it. And the New Paradigm Institute that is at Berkeley now and is going to be gathering major world experts, philosophers, and theologians together to have a discussion that's going to be chaired by Father Jose Gabriel Funes, who is the immediate past director of the Pontifical Observatory in Rome. He is the one who actually chaired the press conference back in November of 2009 at the Vatican and issued this public call for a major serious discussion to begin about the philosophical and theological questions that are going to be posed to our human family by contact with life elsewhere in the universe. And so that what I'm suggesting is that if we start with the cosmological assumption, it appears that the way in which we can account for consciousness, the ontological question, this consciousness that we're so certain is real. That we start out with the assumption that we each experience our consciousness, and we're aware of the fact that there's a discussion going on among our fellow human beings about this issue of consciousness, enough for us to recognize that others are experiencing this as well, it appears. And so this issue of consciousness is that in order for this to be meaningful, and for the consciousness that we experience to be a basis upon which we can reach out and communicate with other extraterrestrial beings, is that they too experience this consciousness. They experience themselves as an integrated consciousness. That they appear to move around. They have shape and form in bodies, potential vehicles that they move around in, etc. And that therefore there's an ontological integrity to the beings that have consciousness. And so that it's through this medium of consciousness that we share potentially in common with them, that we can find a common ground to communicate with them. And so that I believe that we start out with the postulate that the cosmological assumption is correct, that there in fact exists and abides an infinite and eternal sea of consciousness that actually exists, and it exists all the way into infinitude, that it has existed eternally, that it had no beginning. It has no end point, and it's infinite and eternal. And yet it appears to us that there is some type of an apparent occurrence pursuant to which this infinite and eternal sea of consciousness, previously completely undifferentiated, undertakes a process that yields the experience on our part of an apparent differentiation. and that there suddenly appears, to the best of our capacity to discern it at this point, a point where this finite sea of apparently individuated inchoate quantum fields actually manifests. But it initially exists in an unmanifest condition of this finite number of inchoate quantum fields. But what happens is there is an event that occurs after they exist, and they are in this unmanifest state, where one out of all of them manifests as an actual wave of energy, and that all of the rest of them can remain still unmanifest. And so there's only one everywhere in the entire universe, just one inchoate quantum field that has manifested actually in the material realm as a wave of energy. And then it blanks back out. And then there is the next microsecond that two of the inchoate quantum fields the second one manifests as a particle of mass. And then they blank out again. And then the next microsecond, they manifest again, and three of them manifest. Two of them as waves of energy, one as a particle of mass. Not necessarily the same one that manifested as the particle of mass. And that this process starts taking place, and they occur in micromilliseconds, this process. And what happens is the inchoate quantum fields gradually build up more and more into manifestations of waves of energy and particles of mass, and that they then eventually begin to coalesce and join together to form the initial building blocks of what we come to understand as muons and leptons in quarks, in neutrinos, until they end up generating electrons and neutrons and protons and atoms, etc. Now, what happens is this process occurs that starts to generate a material universe. And now, the key to understand, I think, in this particular new paradigm, in my opinion, is that the infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness, when it generates the field of inchoate quantum fields, each of these inchoate quantum fields is conscious. That's the key to understand. This is consciousness itself. In fact, each and every one of the inchoate quantum fields is simply a microcosm of the macrocosm of the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness. And that in their inchoate form, or in their inchoate state, they are still 99% unified in consciousness with the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness. There is just one tiny percentage of differentiation now that they are differentiated in a form of an inchoate quantum field. But 99% is still in complete unison with the infinite and eternal field of consciousness. But when, in fact, that inchoate quantum field manifests as a wave of energy, it actually drops down into being 2% out of unity with the infinite and eternal consciousness. Still remains 98% still in unison with the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness. And when it, in fact, manifests itself into a particle of mass, it is even less in direct unity with the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness. And when they join two of them together, it basically squares the removal of itself from in complete unity with the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness. And what happens is that as they begin to join together and they drop out of a higher and higher degree of unity of consciousness with the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness, they begin to donate that separated nature of their consciousness into potentially forming a separate consciousness. So that when you get a critical number of these inchoate quantum fields together, in that they're manifesting as particles of matter, of mass, and waves of energy, that they're alienating themselves more and more and more from that immediate 99.9% unity with infinite and eternal consciousness. And that they get to a point where there's enough of the alienated consciousness that it can actually form a sense of separate consciousness of the entity. This is the ontological dynamic. The ontological dynamic pursuant to which some particular number of the inchoate quantum fields, when joined together and having an adequate degree of alienated consciousness from the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness, begin to perceive themselves as separate, as a separate entity. And they actually begin to lend to that new collective of inchoate quantum fields an ontological experience of separateness. And this is the ontological process by means of which there is an apparent separation, a separate entification of inchoate quantum fields, separate and apart from the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness. But the reality is that complexification of consciousness begins to occur so that you have a sense of consciousness of an amoeba. You have a consciousness of a small multi-celled entity. You have, and as they begin to alienate more and more, a higher and higher percentage of the consciousness that's in complete union with the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness, that they eventually get to a point where they actually begin to perceive themselves as completely separate and apart from the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness. And that they fail to be conscious of what they really are. They fail to experience that consciousness. And so that what we, as one of the more complex confluences of these inchoate quantum fields, actually get to a point where we forget it entirely. And that we don't realize that at that one and the exact same time in which we're perceiving ourselves as ontologically separate, that in fact there is a remnant of memory. There is a remnant of knowledge that abides within us that is one and the same with the infinite and eternal. And that if in fact we turn our attention to this adequately, and we can recover this, we can actually move our consciousness into that place where we fall into unity with the infinite and eternal. And the fact of the matter is that we can do this in stages. We can, in fact, turn our consciousness to the fact that we are, in fact, an integral part of the planet. We are an integral aspect of the solar system. We are an integral aspect of our galaxy. And that if we learn how to turn our attention and tune our attention to this, we can actually experience our unity with each of these ascending aspects of the infinite and eternal. That this is the capacity that we have as beings, and that what I'm suggesting is that we as individuals, when we quote die, this particular confluence of mass and energy that is us, that it appears, as we most of us I think assume in this room, that our consciousness continues. And that this consciousness actually reincarnates in other beings, in other places, in other physical settings, and that it appears that we may reincarnate any number of times as Homo sapiens, but there is a process. There's an ongoing process pursuant to which we ascend in our ability to discern our remaining unity with the infinite and eternal. And that as that increases, as we're more and more capable of doing that, as our consciousness directs it in that direction, we in fact reincarnate at a higher and higher vibrational frequency. And that we can eventually reincarnate no longer as a physical, material human being, but that we can reincarnate on an astral plane as an astral being at a much higher vibrational frequency. And in fact, we may reincarnate in a different star system, that exists at a much higher vibrational frequency than the frequency of our star here, and that the material manifestation here. And that the fact of the matter is we may go through an entire process of reincarnating in various states of consciousness on the astral plane, and we eventually can reincarnate on a celestial plane. This is all of that strange conversation you hear about various phylums of angels, angelic beings that are at different vibrational frequencies, etc., and have different colors and auras, etc. That the fact of the matter is that it may well be true that we, quote, Homo sapiens, actually reincarnate as beings from other star systems that exist at a state where they have a much higher state of technology, much higher state of culture, and in fact may have a capacity to travel interstellarly, and that may be what we're encountering. So that people say, well, is that us in the future? No, it's us. It's us. We're all the same us. That's the point. That we're all the same experience of consciousness. It's just that there are different vibrational frequencies of this consciousness. And that each of us may incarnate at another time, at another star system, in another frequency, in another dimension. And so that it's really important for us, I think, to begin to understand this. That we have in front of us an experience that is getting ready to happen, as Father Funes and the others said at the Vatican, much sooner than many people think. That we're going to be encountering an extraterrestrial intelligence, and that we really have to start thinking more progressively about who we really are, what our real place in the universe is, and what consciousness is, and what our people are. And so I just want to say in the closing of these remarks, so we can start having some questions here, is that the mode of ethical reasoning that this generates is that the larger and larger community, or larger and larger entity, of which one is an integral part, that your ability to experience yourself as an integral aspect of that particular entity is a higher and higher consciousness. And so that, for example, rather than making a decision to conduct yourself in a way that generates the greatest pleasure, least pain for you as an individual, if you start to perceive yourself as part of a larger community, a larger collective of beings, and you make a decision, for example, such as the Hopi, you make decisions that generate the greatest possible choice for 7 generations removed from you now. You have an allegiance to your tribe. You have an allegiance to your species. You have an allegiance to the other life forms on your planet. You have an allegiance to your planet. That if you make choices that basically are for the benefit of a larger and larger understanding of who you are, that is a mode of ethical reasoning that is extremely important. Okay, and this is the stage that we're at now. We need to be able to develop a consciousness of ourselves as an organic manifestation of our particular planet. And our planet is in grave danger because of the lack of consciousness of a portion of our people who consider themselves completely separate and apart from the planet itself. And they consider themselves, in fact, separate and apart from the rest of the whole species. That they don't experience themselves as being responsible for the goodwill of other people, or for the benefit of other people. So that as you know, that Foster and I have this conversation going on about that his concern about communitarianism and people making decisions predicated upon the good of the larger community rather than for the selfish good of a particular individual. And so there's this dialogue that's going on right now. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to articulate a new paradigm worldview that really understands the metaphysical underpinnings of our allegiance to a larger and larger community. The community of not only human beings, but the community of living things on our planet, the community that includes us and our planet, us and our solar system, us and other living beings in the universe. So that when we encounter these other beings, we will have a direct experience of them being us. That we and they are of the same stuff. And that's going to be an essential thing, because that they're going to be able to recognize immediately whether or not we have that experiential sense of them. It's just like a horse whisperer or anything else, that you know that when in fact you feel the unity that you have with another living being, they realize that you're not there to kill them, to harm them. That's how people can walk among wild animals and not be afraid of them. You know, did not give off that kind of vibe of being afraid or threatening them. That's an experience that we have to be able to develop in ourselves. And there are very certain ways that we understand how we go about training these aspects. The great beings have talked about this. It has to do with our diet, has to do with meditation. It has to do with certain refraining from certain types of overstimulation of our senses and losing touch with the subtle realms. These are all things that we know about. And so what I wanted to do today here in the new paradigm, I wanted to be able to provide some insight into what the architecture is of a new paradigm, what some of the substantive positions are, that would characterize a new paradigm, a radically new paradigm, one that is different from all of the other of the seven major worldviews of the present time, all of which are predicated upon an assumption that we Homo sapiens are the highest life form in the entire universe. You know, that the simple reality is that that isn't true, and that we need to come to grips with that. And so we need to have a worldview that is not frightening, is not denigrating of us. You know, that we're worthy. We're worthy of being respected in the universe, but we have to merit that respect. Okay, so we have to be able to develop this new paradigm worldview. And I believe that if we keep thinking in terms of how it is that we're going to be able to explain who we believe we are and what our role is in the universe, that we need to be thinking in terms of our audience, including these other beings, not just the major institutions that, you know, keep trying to restrain us and keep us attached to this scientific, logical, positivist, materialist worldview. Okay, so that's my initial presentation. So I just want to. So now there's a lot of questions that people have, and I want to be able to answer questions, and I apologize. This is a very complex issue, as you can tell, and so I know there's going to be lots of interesting questions. So let's get a few until they throw us out of here. Is it turned on? Well, no, they won't be able to hear you with it.
Is there a finite number, did you say?
No. I'll repeat. I'll repeat the question.
Is there a finite number, did you say, of these?
Inchoate quantum fields.
Yeah. Or is it an
Oh, let's see. No.
Okay, so I thought
Okay.
there were two.
Yeah.
I heard two positions. One, there's an infinite number, and then no.
No.
Are
No.
you finite?
There's a finite number. Just like the classic, matter can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be transformed from mass into energy or energy into mass. And so therefore there's a finite amount of this in the universe. The universe is made up of the sum total of mass and energy. And mass and energy are made up of, now we know, inchoate quantum fields. And so that the finite number of atoms in the universe are made up of a finite number, much larger number, but finite number of inchoate quantum fields. And that's the fundamental quality and characteristic of them, is that they're finite and they make up a unified cosmos. The postulate of this worldview is that there is, however, an infinite and eternal sea of consciousness, and that is infinite, non-finite, and non-temporally restrained, but that the universe itself is the realm of time, is the realm of material reality, and is confined and limited to the realm of material reality. Now, there are subtle dimensions that are functioning within it, issues of consciousness, etc. And as I've pointed out, I believe that we will find out that the inchoate quantum fields are themselves conscious. Okay? And so that the entire universe of matter is consciousness. It's, in a sense, condensed consciousness.
Thank you, Danny, for laying this out for us. I feel a very strong resonance with what you're saying, and you energize me really deeply. Now, I apologize in advance for possibly misunderstanding you,
Right.
but the way I was taking in your explanation was that our 3D physical state was kind of primary, and we look forward to ultimately progressing to higher and higher states of consciousness. I'm wondering if you may have considered the possibility that some of these higher states are actually our primary state, and what we are doing is evolving toward the direction of 3D physicality, and that this is actually the cutting edge of our creation.
No, I don't think so. I think I'm much more optimistic than that. I believe that it's perfectly clear to me that we're capable of extraordinarily higher states of consciousness, that we've actually experienced other beings. We've all had the good fortune of encountering other human beings that are so much more advanced than we are that we're kind of awestruck by their state of being. And that the avatars and the major people they explain this. No, well, that I guess I'll be humble. I don't think I am. I hold out higher prospects for my future. I just believe that some of the people that I've encountered, the few that I've encountered, I know positively that they know stuff that I don't know. That they're higher beings, and that they talk about this entire unfolding, and that there is this entire future that we have as a species where we are evolving toward these higher and higher states, even as Homo sapiens. And I believe, I touched on it yesterday, I believe that there are other faculties that we have that remain latent at the present time that will unfold. Not just this sixth sense, this extrasensory perception that we have of precognition and remote viewing, etc., but that there are other faculties that we don't even know what the nature of them are yet, that have to do with our other chakras basically being unlocked and actually filled in. that we have to go. And so that I believe that we will get to that point, and there is a point where we as Homo sapiens will in fact evolve into the next species. So that Homo sapiens ourselves have a limited run as such. And just like as Cro-Magnons and others, that we will probably evolve up into a higher species. But I just believe that there's more than meets the eye. That we'll go into another astral plane, another celestial plane. We have an entire topography to go yet. And that we're fairly early in the stages of this.
This is quite a conversation. What I have to say is hard to say, but what I actually want to say is there's a reason why it's hard to say. It should be hard to say, and it's the comment I want to make and ask you about. And I'm sure a lot of people have had the same study, same experiences. We all read a lot of the same stuff, but the testimony of the mystics, or the people that you just referred to, who have realized something about what we're saying, what they say is that this realization or this understanding, you put it in terms of, is completely non-conceptual. As a matter of fact, it can't be conceptual. That's the whole point. And I'm looking for, in the way you parse this, and I love you. This is not criticism.
No.
That you're not. I haven't heard discernment in the way you've put it forward when you use the pronouns. Yeah. And it's really easy for me to think about it. As I listen, it's like, well, I'm going to become this, and I'm going there. But the mystics say there is no I. There's no this person that we keep referring to, and it's really easy to form a wrong-headed mental model of what this is when we continue. And language can't be other than that, but all we can do is remember to put in the discernment or differentiation in the words. When we say I, it's not the I that, you know what I'm saying?
No, I understand completely.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's why I'm trying to point out that this sense of ourselves as separate eyes, that all the mystics tell us that this is an illusion. And all we have to do is realize that we are, in fact, in unison with the infinite and eternal, that's just true. And we just don't realize it, and that we're living in kind of an illusion, kind of a shadow world. Plato talks about this, the shadows on the wall of the caves, etc. Yes, no, that's right. But that as a lawyer, I would suggest that we have a task in front of us. It's that one of the things you'll also note with a lot of the mystical writings is the fact that the entire world disintegrates or burns and our whole species disappears doesn't really make that much difference. I tend to be biased in behalf of us. I view myself in a certain sense as counsel to our species in some sense, that I'd like us to do much better. And so what I'm saying is that this paradox does abide. But the fact of the matter is we can at the same time take care of our species, take care of our human family, take care of our planet, take care of the other living beings on our planet, and still be cognizant of the fact of what the mystics tell us, that in fact we're part of an infinite and eternal being, and that we can be cognizant of that. In this whole argument about whether this is an evolutionary process or whether or not if we just get it, if we get it, then we've got it. That I have found that more difficult. I know that doing meditation and going through this process, this kind of step-by-step process of following the guidance of some of the mystics and the avatars, that you can feel it unfolding in you. You can actually begin to experience what it is that they're talking about. And so that I think that for those of us who are in the earlier phases of this, what I'm hoping to do is to be able to it's sort of a bodhisattva trip, is that we need to really bring our sisters and brothers, all of us, along together to progress into this process. It's absolutely clear that there are high beings who are calling to us in announcing the good news, and that we're moving toward that. And so I'm trying to assist all of us in moving in that direction, with hopes that each of us will come to a point where the light will come on, and perhaps we'll jump an entire octave in our consciousness. That may well be, but I want to get us all there as quickly as I can. But I'm fully cognizant of this. And the one thing that lawyers always have a prejudice toward being able to articulate and conceptualize something, even if it's ineffable. So, yeah.
So, having emerged from the world of CIIS, I wanted to add a few things. The authoritarian end of your spectrum, many of the speakers here and many of us who have been in this community aware of other pieces of information are aware that there's a duplicity with that, because what we're being told is that they're operating from a three-dimensional perspective, when in fact they're not, and they're using the occult. Okay?
I hear what you're saying.
You know, Richard and Catherine and many of us in this room are aware of that. So there's a lie already that they're using on that end of the spectrum. The second thing I wanted to bring in is that in terms of creating this new paradigm, what I hope is brought into it at these levels that you're dealing with is a little bit more of the feminine. Notions, for example, of birthing and how the universe perhaps could be a uterine structure and there could be a big birth instead of a big bang, which I think is missing from, it's a phallocentric view. Okay? Not that there's anything, I'm not trying to foment argumentation and division across genders, but just I think this aspect needs to be brought in. And related to that, the third point would be that there are many people in this room and at this gathering who have been channeling cosmologies for quite some time. And some of it has to do with bringing in that feminine element and those feminine concepts. And also the idea, I wasn't sure if you were just talking about evolution being one way, but that there are ideas that we have actually been seeded many, many times by these beings, these interdimensionals, and there's been traffic and Congress back and forth. And so I would hope that that would be also brought into what you're discussing at these levels.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, there are numerous other pieces of data that can be taken into account, as we know that there's that Zecharia Sitchin in all of his 12th planet stuff, his translation of the tablets. There's all kinds of other potential data here that could suggest that there are potential interventions in the evolution of our human family. What I'm trying to do is suggest that there's certain things that may not be entirely within our hands, that the decisions that may be made by extraterrestrial beings as to whether to intervene or not, or whether to seed a new stage of development of us, that what I'm trying to do is have us take full responsibility for that which we can get access to right now, and stand open to other possibilities. And the issue you raise about the feminine dimension to this, that it's clear that the mystical dimension, the higher worldviews, the higher vibrational worldviews, are characterized by more and more feminine principles than these. And but I want to address the last point you made about the potential occult utilization of this stuff. It's a very interesting thing. I've dealt with a lot of these people in this authoritarian worldview, and I'm perfectly aware of a lot of the stuff with Hitler and the tools and the Spear of Destiny, all of that kind of occult stuff that they're doing. My experience is that the people who postulate that are very unprofessional. Very unsophisticated in their investigatory techniques, and it's a lot of it is is sort of mythology. Because the people that I've encountered, which have to do very high Nazi people from the Second World War, et cetera, is that they're a lot less sophisticated than that. They really are. They're very crude, very unsophisticated. And I haven't found a lot of indications of that stuff. That their relationship with the occult, a lot of it was generated by Hitler himself, who had this kind of set of fascinations with it. But that was more in kind of the realm of seeking out symbols that he could utilize that were kind of mythological to try to stimulate and manipulate people. So I've never found any yet. I've not found convincing evidence that they were really tapped into genuine access to these other metaphysical dimensions. Yeah, but I'm obviously I know what the issue is, and we're cognizant of that possibility.
Thank you. Just in the interest of trying to evolve the way we use language around these considerations, earlier you said that we could begin to see ourselves as an integral part or an integral piece of the solar system and then the galaxy and so on.
Yeah, experience ourselves as that. Yeah.
Exactly. And the only objection I have to that is there is the holographic model where instead of seeing ourselves as a piece of God, a fingernail of God, that the holographic model says that we were all of all it is from a limited point of view. Mm-hmm. And that one of the ways, perhaps the best way to expand that view is what you said earlier, is to see that we have value, that we can let go of the guilt that may have come from the original Big Bang of being disconnected, and the degree to which we can let go of those feelings of unworthiness is the degree to which we can begin to see ourselves as all it is.
Yes, no, I agree with that. And I would think that what it is that we are a function, a holographic function of the larger and infinite and eternal. That's that whole thing that they talk about of us being in the likeness of the infinite and eternal. So I think it's a holographic phenomenon. Right. I agree.
One last question. This is a wonderful presentation here, but just in terms of taking this into a cocktail situation. And I've tried this before, sitting down with somebody, having a drink, and trying to discern whether there's any opportunity for dialogue. And what I've come up with, and I'd like to see if you think this in some way summarizes this, is I've said, well, there's two ways to look at the world, the reality. We can say that consciousness creates physical reality, or physical reality creates consciousness. And on that, everything hinges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's actually the physical universe is a function of consciousness. That's right. No, I think that is true. But you want to be careful about playing into setting up a dialectic where you're just us and them. That there's two basic camps arguing with each other over this thing. That there's this, and that the paradox of the apparent separateness of the universe and the apparent material manifestation of the universe, while at one and the same time being part of the infinite and eternal, is part. Lawyers don't like paradoxes, and so I'm trying to figure out how we deal with this without losing the value of understanding that we can in fact be one in the same with the infinite and eternal and still experience ourselves in our incarnated state. That's the ideal state. I have this long debate going with my son over this, who's a graduate in political philosophy from Harvard, and they're radical structuralists and materialists, and that's part of what the New Paradigm Institute is going to be dealing with up here at Berkeley, as we take up this task of trying to integrate this kind of cosmic perspective and figure out the public policy implications of this. Yes.
I'd first like to express my deep gratitude for your unique service to our United States of America.
Yeah.
And and to our United States of being. And I think I fit into the category of an idealistic realist or a realistic idealist, depending on the hour of the day. And I'm earning a living as a collusion analyst, and a solutionist. And so my way to, I'd like to engage your constitutional lawyer consciousness, if I may.
Okay.
And so my way to get involved and create change was to get on the ballot to challenge Dianne Feinstein in 2006 and 2012 primary elections. Primarily, the most important issue that I wanted to put attention on, to magnify and illuminate, was unconstitutional wars of choice. The Constitution was created when we wanted to make a change. We made an amendment during Vietnam, Nixon and the War Powers Act to work around, and then every activity we've done since then, and in particular after 9/11, it was Public Law 107243 that was the
Authorization use of force.
Yes, and
Yeah.
when it was for Iraq, it wasn't just armed, it wasn't just
It wasn't
military
actually
force.
it wasn't actually for Iraq. It was for actually those who perpetrated the attack at 9/11. It was
Well,
actually the authorization for the use of force.
And for Afghanistan, it was military force, and then this particular one, 107243 for Iraq, it stated, and by the way, it said, as determined as he determines to see fit. So, meaning if we have a female president, they'd have to change the law anyway. But it also included the use of armed forces, which could be our local law enforcement. So to me, any time that we determine we're going to take a life without due process is a crime. And to do so in brute force fashion anywhere around the U.S.,
Okay.
I mean world, without Congress.
Yeah.
So that's why I challenged Feinstein. And I would like to see how we can use the Constitution. We could use math, use social networking. Article 5 that says 2/3 of the states on the same page of any particular issue, we can overturn Congress, President, and the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So with the Occupy movement and 17 attorney generals in 17 states, and then 23 took on the big bad banks. So I think that we could harness our constitutional rights and powers. And if by coming to local city council meetings, board of supervisors, or states, just show up until it's done,
Yes.
of taking our power back.
Okay. Well,
With the
let me-
Constitution.
the short response to that is that yes, I believe that under the present Constitution that we have, that there is a very clear method by means of which the new paradigm, again, much to the consternation, I think, of Foster, is that a logical political party would be perfectly logical to have, to be able to articulate a set of public policy proposals that are very clear, concrete, and specific, and to organize and mobilize people into a new paradigm movement, just like the old Chautauqua movement did back in the late 1890s and early 1900s, to generate a progressive social change movement on the planet pursuant to the principles of a new paradigm. And that's within the constitutional structures. And so you would have challenges to sitting candidates, and you don't have to challenge them for the nomination within the Democratic Party. You can be nominated on an individual other political party ticket. Yeah, so it's all there, and that we can espouse these ideas and proselytize on behalf of them, and actually set forth policy for the country. Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'd like to engage your Professor Sheehan side. Thank you for the philosophy lecture. I haven't had one since an undergraduate. I was an undergraduate. But I'm not trying to be negative, Dan.
All right.
What I want to ask is a feeling, because you probably don't know the answer. And the feeling is, with what you've stated here, if we're all brought to a room, or not all of us, but specific representatives of the human race, and an advanced civilization asks us, like you say here, to follow this, it's going to be very hard to get consensus. I mean, you have a Jesuit, and then you've got, you're going to have other people in the room. My question to you is, how do you answer this when there are people who have been abducted? This doesn't seem like a higher civilization. When there are people, and I can't speak from personal experience, but people who have seen shadow people around them, people from other dimensions. If this is an advanced civilization, what are your feelings on how we answer this? We ask them, why are you abducting us?
Okay, this is a question that John Mack and I used to talk about all the time when we were training people who were repeated abductees to do Stanislav Grof's holotropic breathing, et cetera, and try to get them calmed down when they had this experience to be able to dialogue with some of these beings. Any type of discussion that you have with beings who come from a different culture, whether it be the negotiations which are coming to a head today with Iran and the United States, or our negotiations with North Korea or with China or with Russia, or even among our own people of our own species, all require a certain amount of diplomacy and tact, where you express to them your degree of dissatisfaction with certain type of conduct that you see them engaging in, and trying to solicit their agreement to stop participating in that and comport their conduct more in accordance with your ethical principles. That's part of the interesting dialogue that we're going to be having with these beings. But that's why it's important for us to have an understanding on our part of what it is that we're espousing. We don't want to sit down with them and be advocating that that they join us as military allies against Russia or China, but there are those who would. In fact, there's arguments that there are those who have, already done that. And so what I'm trying to do is, as a community, I'm trying to lift us up in the new paradigm community to be able to elucidate and articulate certain principles and premises that we can share in common, so that when we find ourselves in that situation, we can know what type of degree of consternation to express about certain things they've done, and try to solicit their cooperation in engaging in certain kinds of conduct that we think are beneficial for everybody, them and us as well. So I appreciate the issue of putting it on the table.
First, I want to thank you for your service, because I've read your first book. It was incredible what you've done, and I'm looking forward to the second book, where you tell us who shot JFK and break all that apart, tell about your UFO experiences.
Yeah.
And then the third book, I have no idea what that's going to be about.
That's what we're doing right now. We're doing the third book right now.
And then
That's what this
number
is.
two, I want to thank you for starting this place in Berkeley, the
Yes.
Paradigm place, because I was wanting to get involved with you, but I had trouble driving all the way down to Santa Cruz. But number three, what I wanted to point out was, when you gave your lecture yesterday, you had 7 stages there, and you've only really filled in 4 here.
Oh, yes.
And I assume you have an eighth stage that you're adding to it.
That's
and
right.
I just wanted to speak up for Arthur Young, because his 7-stage process is really that he invented before, after he made the helicopter and got the first commercial patent.
Yep.
Said there were 7 stages of process, and the 8th is a fulfillment or starting a new stage. So
That's right.
One begins all over. He
All right.
talked about loss of physical body, and the 7-stage repeating holographic fractal thing before those words were in existence.
All right, let me just comment. Yes, this understanding on the part of our human family that there are these 7 different worldviews or different stages of development that we go through is a fairly widely recognized academic schematic. And that's why I use it as a basis for us to understand this. And it is true that this new paradigm worldview that we're talking about is, in fact, an 8th worldview. It is really the completion of the octave of these worldviews. And just like, as you know, that in the way that the spectrum has the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, and indigo and violet, what you understand is that if, in fact, you take laser beams of each of these primary colors and you shine them onto a single point, those laser lights will set up a mutual interference pattern that generates white light. That is the source of the white light. And that I think that's what we're dealing with here, is that we need to come to understand what each of these different worldviews brings to the table for our human family, just like with the chakras. It's not that one of the chakras is superior over others, even though there's this tendency to think that. All of the chakras have to be fully activated in operating for a human being to be their fully evolved self. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to get that 8th chakra that abides up above the head, open and functioning. And that we assume that it's very well possible that that particular 8th chakra resonates at the exact vibrational frequency of the lowest chakra of the next octave of being. That there's an integrated relationship between ourselves and other beings that exist on other vibrational dimensions. Yes.